Good morning, or afternoon or evening, depending on when you're watching this. We're into the final 2 weeks of class, and you have been on quite a journey these weeks, looking at reading about immersing yourselves in the worlds of others. Uh, some of them are worlds that some of you are familiar with because you're involved in conversations, faith conversations in particular areas, because you have strangers living in your midst. Others of you have traveled internationally and, been exposed to or gotten to know people from other places. Still, others of you, this is new and still aren't quite sure what this course is about or what to make of it or why in the world this is part of your seminary education and training to be leaders in the church. What I'd like to do is think through that with you in these last 2 weeks. And this week, and I will take the lead in those conversations. Some of what I say today will be posted online with some of the quotes and references. But what we're doing today, it's as I'm recording this, it's the first Sunday in Advent, which is when we begin to think not about Christmas, but we deliberately enter a time of waiting, watching, and wondering what it means that God comes into human time, what it means to anticipate God with us in some way. It's also World AIDS Day, and a day set aside December 1st every year to commemorate, to mark what effect that disease has had on the world and those who are vulnerable. I have friends, people I know who are HIV positive, they're living positive, some who have died, and maybe you do as well. Early in the crisis, before we even really knew what it was, I remember sitting at doing hospital chaplaincy and sitting with a young man whose family had abandoned him for his lifestyle, who was dying, and there wasn't much of him left when we visited, and some deep conversations about life and death, and purpose and meaning, and becoming unclean in that once diagnosed. It's also, we're on the end of Thanksgiving weekend, or Thanksgivika this year, and those of you who live in communities where there's a large Jewish population, or maybe you have family members or friends who are part of the Jewish community by tradition or by faith, have a sense of what that means this weekend. So with all of those as a background, we plunge ahead, and we're moving into. We're going to take 2 quick steps this morning that will, I think, frame the conversation that we have this week and next week, but also frame the conversations we've been having so far. In the last part of the Partridge book, I think it's Unit 14, and it's assigned reading for this week. I encourage you first to read that carefully and make some notes. I'm going to cite a couple of things from there and some of the ideas as well as some specific information, and then talk about how that relates to what we've been doing and where we're going and what it means for you as you finish this course and continue with your seminary career. The last section of the book talks about shifts in thinking about truth. Martin Luther, when he made his stand and attacked the 95 Theses, wanted to have a conversation about some things. And later, in defending himself, and then the writings that emerged out of that in the Book of Concord, the Confessions, made some bold statements about truth. This is what we know about God. This is what the Scriptures say. This is who we are, and we will not. This is where we stand. This is where I stand. That was in the 1500s. Over the centuries after that, as we move from the medieval age to the contemporary ages, something called modernity emerged. And I'm going to read just a section from Partridge. Modernity is often associated with universal rational truth claims, especially those put forth by mathematics and science. By contrast, postmodernism expresses a loss of confidence in any universal truth. All claims to truth are viewed as constructs, which only serve the interests of particular groups. That's on page 438, midway down through the first complete paragraph. Now, there are debates about when post-modernity began and when it ended. We're kind of moved past it, and we'll go there in just a moment. But post-modernity, depending on when you time it, seems to be associated with the rising feminism. Some point to the Betty Friedan's publication of the Feminine Mystique. Others talk about, I've heard someone talk about the development of the microchip and the change of communication. When it happened isn't so important as what happened, and that is we suddenly realized that white European men no longer had the sole authoritative corner on truth. Because much of what was considered normative, civilized, and real, rational, came out of Europe, mostly through the voices of men. And so with the rise of feminism, the rise of a consciousness that women had a different story to tell, that some processed information differently, that they had different ways of thinking about the world. In the midst of that, there was a growing movement in literature to recognize and realize that many of the people who had been colonized, who were learning the Western way, had their own histories and had their own perspectives, particularly those who had been enslaved, whose histories were one of being persecuted, prosecuted, pushed down by the white European male establishment or educational system. And so postmodernity began to say which perspective, which way of thinking about the world is true as opposed to another. And that threw the world into some, and the academy, universities and seminaries and church bodies into some chaos for a while. What is it we stand for? What do we stand on? What is true? And what is just in my humble opinion? And in some ways, that's a little bit of what we've been exposed to so far this semester, delving into the experiences of others and listening to the narratives that they tell from their perspective, and not twisting them or turning them or shaping them, co-opting them for our own uses, but thinking about what does it mean to be Melanesian in a fast-changing world? Or what does it mean to be people who were impacted by colonialism in the highlands of Kenya? Or what does it mean to be Yupik and have a different set of stories, a different collection of stories? What does it mean to be Muslim in the Middle East? So we read through those, and we've been doing that, thinking about difference from the perspective of others. And some of you have gotten really upset about some of what you've read. Some of you embraced it. Some of you have not been quite sure what to do with it. Well, that's where we've gone. In the text, there's also, in the Partridge text, there's also a little section on sacralization and secularization. There was a sense that once we got into postmodernity, perhaps there was no place for God anymore. because God was shaped by our own experience. Partridge mentions that, and Nietzsche talks a little bit about that too, the Nietzsche quote in there. And so we thought, well, perhaps religion would go away, that we would become a secular world. But we've really had two streams happen. We've had secularization has increased, particularly in North America, but sacralization, that is a sense of the sacred, has increased as well. And the book outlines the turns to the East, the fascination with Eastern thought, with Eastern meditation, yoga, healing, things like that, as well as the explosion of charismatic Pentecostal Christianity across parts of Africa, Latin America, and the rise of jihad in the Muslim world, and many other things. So we're in that tension, and it's not a surprise, it shouldn't be a surprise to us, that the State Department back in August, late August, early September, established a chair, a seat at the state, a desk at the state, to look at religion, because John Kerry and others were finding that at the heart of many of the conflicts they were dealing with, the religious claims were at the center of those. And that's a sign of sacralization, a kind of a turn to the sacred in some new ways. So I give you that as we think about, kind of transitions and what's going on in our world today. The book then goes into, and this is where we're at. We've got to move past postmodernity. We're living in this tension of sacred and sacral and secular. But we're also, globalization is becoming a big deal, something that's having a significant impact in the world today. And globalization, they say, is as hard to define as religion is, and ergo culture is. Something about these words we don't like. But the Partridge text mentions the religion in globalization as both a cause of globalization, but also an effect of globalization. And one of those is that in societies that are undergoing rapid transitions, there is a turn to wanting to return to some sacred ways, some of the ways of the ancestors, perhaps. And in thinking about those, what we call revitalization movements have emerged. Revitalization movements are movements that turn to a past. It might be imagined. It might be a past that is reconstructed. But some of the conservative Christian movements in the U.S. today, prior to Francis in the Roman Catholic Church, some of the talk about kind of an ancient mass and things like that, were parts of a revitalization. Let's go back to our roots. And even today, jihad in the Muslim world is a revitalization movement, a saying we don't like what the West is doing to the world, and so we want to reclaim and battle those who we want to reclaim Islam in its purest form, and get rid of the things that the West has introduced. Well, I'm going to stop there because YouTube's only going to let me post for 15 minutes, and I'm going to give you a second conversation that tells us where we're going this week with our conversation, and how we're going to get there. So stay tuned for part 2.